You're walking to work on a January morning. It's cold. Your breath fogs in front of you. Snow starts to fall, which is annoying but expected. You look down at your coat sleeve to brush it off, and the snow is red. Not pink, not slightly tinted. Red. Like someone ground up rust and scattered it from the clouds. You look around. Everyone else has stopped walking too. The rooftops are turning red. The streets are turning red. The snow keeps falling, and none of it is the right color. Now imagine you have absolutely no idea what the atmosphere is, what a volcano is, or that Indonesia exists. You have the Book of Revelation, a priest who's been warning you about the end of days, and a sky that appears to be bleeding. That is exactly what happened across northern Europe in the winter of 1258. And the explanation was buried under a mountain 8,000 miles away. A mountain so powerful that it erased itself from the map. In early 1258, something fell from the sky across parts of England, northern France, and the Low Countries that had no business being there. Snow drifted down carrying a color that didn't belong. In some places, it looked like diluted rust. In others, like watered-down wine. It settled on rooftops, on frozen fields, on the stone steps of parish churches, a thin, discolored layer that stained everything it touched and offered absolutely no explanation for itself. A Benedictine monk named Matthew Paris, writing from his priory in St. Albans, recorded that winter as one of the worst anyone alive could remember. His chronicle describes a sequence of disasters that stacked on top of each other without pause. A sulfurous fog that clung to the land for weeks and refused to lift, crops failing before harvest, livestock dropping dead in pastures for no visible reason, and a famine already tightening its grip before the red snow even showed up. The snow wasn't the worst thing that happened that year. It was the strangest. Now here's where you have to adjust your brain to think like a medieval European. You have no framework for atmospheric chemistry. You have no concept of volcanic aerosols or stratospheric sulfur dioxide. What you do have is a very detailed religious text that has specific opinions about blood falling from the sky, and a local priest who has been waiting his entire career for exactly this moment. Street preachers in London and Paris declared the end of days. Churches that had been half empty filled to the walls overnight. Processions of barefoot penitents walked through frozen streets, praying for the sky to go back to normal. The red snow was not treated as a weather curiosity. It was treated as a verdict, a judgment from a god who had run out of patience. In the countryside, farmers walked their fields at dawn and found red-dusted snow covering furrows that should have been white. Sheep came out of overnight shelter with faint pink stains matted into their wool. Children scooped the discolored snow into their hands and watched it melt into water, tinted the color of weak wine. In an age where the natural world ran on rules, handed down by God, snow changing color was not a weather event. It was a message, and the message did not seem friendly. But the sky wasn't finished. The sulfurous fog didn't clear when the snow stopped. A thick yellowish veil hung over northern Europe for months, dimming the sun to a pale disk that cast light but delivered no warmth. Travelers reported the haze smelled faintly of rotten eggs. Summer arrived late and barely registered. Temperatures stayed cold enough that crops simply refused to ripen. Wheat that should have been harvested in July stood green and stunted in September. Fruit rotted on branches before it could mature. The growing season never came. And then the famine started. Across England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, crop yields collapsed in a single season. Wheat prices in London doubled, then tripled, then climbed beyond what a laboring family could afford on a full week's wages. The poor died first, not in a dramatic wave, but in a slow, grinding attrition that stretched across months. Matthew Paris recorded 15,000 deaths in London alone. Modern historians think that number is inflated, but even the conservative estimates describe a catastrophe. The pattern repeated across the continent. Monastery chronicles in the Rhine Valley describe villages losing a quarter of their population to starvation and the infections that follow it. In northern France, entire harvests froze in fields that should have been warm. The price of bread in Paris hit levels not seen in a generation. None of it made sense to anyone living through it. The medieval climate had been warm and stable for centuries, warm enough to grow wine grapes in central England. Then the temperature dropped as if someone had closed a door. One year the harvests were reliable. The next, the sun vanished behind a haze that smelled like sulfur, and the food supply collapsed. That's not bad luck. That's a system failure. And the system that failed was 8,000 miles away. In 2013, a team of French and Indonesian geologists published a paper that solved a 756-year-old mystery. The volcano was called Samalas. It once stood on the island of Lombok, in what is now Indonesia. In the summer of 1257, roughly 6 months before the first red snow reached Europe, Samalas erupted with a force that modern scientists estimate at about 8 times the explosive power of Krakatoa. That sentence deserves a moment. 8 times Krakatoa. And most people have never heard of it. The eruption didn't ooze lava down a mountainside. Samalas detonated. The blast column punched through the lower atmosphere and into the stratosphere, reaching an estimated altitude of 43 kilometers. The volcano ejected roughly 40 cubic kilometers of rock, ash, and pumice in a matter of hours. That is enough material to bury Manhattan under 100 meters of debris. The eruption was so violent that it destroyed the mountain itself. Where Samalas once stood, a crater lake called Segara Anak now fills the hole. The immediate devastation was total. The kingdom of Lombok was buried under pyroclastic flows, superheated avalanches of gas, and pulverized rock moving at over 200 kilometers per hour. A Javanese text called the Babad Lombok describes the kingdom's destruction and the scattering of survivors across neighboring islands. A person standing 3 kilometers from the vent would have had less than 60 seconds between the first visible surge and the arrival of a wall of gas at 700 degrees. But the eruption's worst effects weren't local. They were global. Millions of tons of sulfur dioxide launched into the upper atmosphere reacted with water vapor to form a fine mist of sulfuric acid droplets, an aerosol veil that spread across both hemispheres. This veil scattered incoming sunlight before it could reach the ground. Temperatures dropped worldwide. Sunsets turned vivid red. Daylight dimmed to sickly yellow. And precipitation filtering through all of that suspended volcanic particulate picked up the color of what it fell through. 6 months after the mountain exploded, red-tinted snow fell on English churches. The volcano responsible was on an island most Europeans wouldn't hear about for another 300 years. Here's the part that makes this story genuinely strange. Scientists didn't find Samalas by reading old chronicles. They found it by drilling into ice. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica contain layered chemical records of the atmosphere stretching back tens of thousands of years. Each winter's snowfall traps a sample of whatever was floating in the air. Dust, pollen, sea salt, volcanic sulfate. In cores from both hemispheres, researchers found an enormous sulfate spike in the layers dated to 1258, one of the single largest volcanic signals in the entire 10,000-year Holocene record. The spike had been known since the 1980s, but for 30 years, nobody could identify the source. Krakatoa was too recent. Tambora, the eruption that caused the famous year without a summer, was 6 centuries too late. The volcano that produced the signal appeared to have vanished from the geological record entirely. It had. It had blown itself apart. A French geoscientist named Franck Lavigne finally cracked it by combining Javanese historical texts, geological surveys of the crater deposits on Lombok, radiocarbon dating of charcoal buried in pyroclastic layers, and the sulfate signature frozen in polar ice. The eruption of Samalas in 1257 was responsible for everything: the sulfate spike, the fog, the famine, the red snow. An eruption larger than anything in recorded modern history had happened within sight of a thriving medieval kingdom, destroyed that kingdom completely, altered the global climate for years, killed tens of thousands of people on a continent that had no idea the island existed, and then vanished from human memory for 7.5 centuries. The mountain erased itself. The ice remembered. So the next time you look out a window and see snow falling, white, ordinary, unremarkable, consider that in 1258, people looked out their windows and saw something that made them believe the world was ending. They weren't stupid. They weren't superstitious fools. They were watching the sky do something it had never done in living memory, and they used the only framework they had to explain it. The real explanation was a mountain they'd never heard of, on an island they didn't know existed, 8,000 miles away, that had exploded so violently it changed the color of the sky for an entire continent. The mountain is gone. The lake is still there, and the snow that winter was red.